The rain fell in steady sheets that October afternoon, turning the streets of downtown Hartford into rivers of gray water and forgotten dreams. David Matthews sat behind the wheel of his aging pickup truck, windshield wipers, fighting a losing battle against the storm. At 34, his hands bore the calluses of a man who worked with steel and concrete, but his eyes held the gentle weariness of a father who tucked his daughter into bed each night with stories and prayers for a better tomorrow. 8-year-old Sophie pressed her face against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the world blur past in watery streaks. Her school backpack lay forgotten at her feet, filled with drawings of stick-figure families and spelling tests marked with gold stars. She had her father's kind eyes and her late mother's stubborn chin, though she was too young to understand the weight of loss that lived quietly in their small apartment. The bus stop came into view like a scene from a forgotten painting. Most people hurried past, umbrellas tilted against the wind, their faces turned away from the lone figure hunched beneath the inadequate shelter. But David saw her. Emily sat motionless in her wheelchair, a hospital blanket draped over her legs, soaked through from hours of waiting. Her dark hair clung to her face like wet silk, and her 25-year-old frame seemed impossibly small against the storm's fury. Sophie's small hand found her father's arm. She didn't speak, but her wide eyes said everything. In that moment, David felt something shift in his chest, the same feeling he'd had the night Sophie was born, when he first understood that love wasn't just an emotion but a call to action. Without a word, he pulled over. The rain hit David like a cold slap as he stepped from the truck. Emily looked up, startled, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and fear that spoke of too many disappointments. She tried to wheel herself backward, deeper into the shadows of the shelter, but David was already shrugging off his work jacket. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle as he draped the jacket around her shoulders. "This storm's not letting up. You can't stay out here." Emily's lips trembled, whether from cold or emotion, he couldn't tell. "I'm fine," she whispered, but the words held no conviction. "I'm waiting for the bus." David glanced at the digital display above the shelter. The next bus wouldn't arrive for 2 hours. He looked back at Emily, taking in the worn wheelchair, the thin clothes, the way she held herself as if expecting the world to deliver another blow. "Come with me," he said. Those 3 words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Emily stared at him, this stranger with kind eyes and calloused hands, this man who had stopped when everyone else had passed by. In the truck, Sophie had pressed her small face against the window, watching the scene unfold with the intense curiosity of childhood. "I don't know you," Emily said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Name's David Matthews. This is my daughter Sophie." He gestured toward the truck. "We've got a warm place, some hot soup, and a dry couch. Sometimes that's enough for now." Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of months spent sleeping in shelters, of doors closing in her face, of voices that spoke about her as if she weren't there. When she opened them again, David was still waiting, rain streaming down his face, his jacket growing heavier on her shoulders with each passing second. "Okay," she whispered. The drive home was quiet except for Sophie's occasional questions about Emily's wheelchair and David's patient explanations about how some people needed wheels instead of legs to get around. Emily found herself watching this father and daughter, noting the way David glanced in the rearview mirror to make sure she was comfortable, how Sophie had insisted Emily take her favorite blanket from the back seat. David's apartment was small but clean, filled with the kind of warmth that comes from love rather than money. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator, and a half-completed puzzle of a lighthouse sat on the coffee table. Emily remained in her wheelchair by the door, uncertain, until Sophie appeared with a towel and a pair of fuzzy slippers that were clearly too big for her small feet. "Daddy says you can stay for dinner," Sophie announced with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. "We're having mac and cheese. It's my favorite." That first evening stretched into night, and night became dawn. David had given Emily the couch, arranging blankets and pillows with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making do with less. When she woke to the smell of coffee and pancakes, she found Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor nearby, coloring in a book and humming softly. "Morning," David said from the kitchen, as if having a stranger sleep in his living room was the most natural thing in the world. "Hope you're hungry." Emily's throat tightened. It had been so long since anyone had said good morning to her, since she'd woken up to the sounds of a family beginning their day. She tried to remember the last time someone had looked at her and seen a person rather than a problem to be solved or avoided. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. David would leave for work at the construction site, his hard hat tucked under one arm, and a thermos of coffee in his hand. Sophie would chatter away about school and friends and the book she was reading, treating Emily not as a guest or a charity case, but simply as someone who belonged. And Emily, who had spent months feeling invisible, began to remember what it felt like to be seen. But belonging, she had learned, was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I should go," she said one evening as David cleared the dinner dishes. They'd been together for nearly 2 weeks, and she could see the strain around his eyes, the way he checked his wallet twice before going to the grocery store. How he'd started buying generic brands and skipping his morning coffee. David paused, a plate halfway to the sink. "Did something happen?" "You've been kind," Emily said carefully. "Kinder than I deserve. But I can't keep taking from you and Sophie. This wheelchair, me being here, it's not fair to either of you." Sophie looked up from her homework, pencil frozen in her small hand. "But you help me with my reading. And you make the best grilled cheese ever. And Daddy smiles more when you're here." Emily felt her chest tighten. She'd noticed it too, the way David's shoulders had relaxed over the past weeks, how he laughed at Sophie's jokes instead of just smiling politely. There had been moments, brief flashes, when she'd caught him watching her with something that looked almost like contentment. "Sometimes," David said quietly, sitting down across from her, "the best things aren't fair. Sometimes they're just necessary." That night, Emily lay awake listening to the sounds of the apartment settling around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Sophie's soft breathing and the occasional creak of David's bed as he shifted in his sleep. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. But safety, she had learned, was often temporary. The story she told them came in pieces, fragments shared over morning coffee and evening meals. Her name was Emily Catherine Harrison, though the last name felt foreign on her tongue now. She'd grown up in a mansion in Greenwich, daughter of tech mogul Robert Harrison, whose fortune had been built on software innovations and strategic acquisitions. The accident had happened 3 years ago. She remembered the rain, similar to the storm that had brought David into her life. She remembered her father's driver taking a corner too fast, the sound of crushing metal, and then nothing for months. When she'd finally woken up in a rehabilitation hospital, her legs were gone in all the ways that mattered, and her family had been told she was dead. "They had a funeral," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it later, in old newspaper articles. There were flowers and speeches about what a bright future I'd had." David reached across the small kitchen table and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough and warm, grounding her in the present moment. "Memory's a strange thing," she continued. "For almost 2 years, I couldn't remember who I was. The doctors said it was trauma-related, that my mind was protecting me from something too painful to process. By the time I remembered, I'd been bounced from facility to facility, discharged and readmitted, labeled as a Jane Doe with nowhere to go." Sophie listened from her perch on David's lap, her 8-year-old mind processing the story with the peculiar wisdom of children. "That's so sad," she said finally. "But you're here now. And we won't forget you." Emily smiled through her tears, understanding for the first time that family wasn't always about blood or money or grand gestures. Sometimes, it was about small hands, offering crayons, and gentle voices, reading bedtime stories, and the quiet certainty that someone would be there when you woke up afraid. But the world outside their small apartment had different ideas about what Emily's life should look like. It started with whispers from neighbors in the hallway. David would catch fragments of conversation as he carried groceries up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. "That girl in the wheelchair," they'd say. "Seems strange, a single man taking in some random woman off the streets." His coworkers were less subtle. "You sure you know what you're doing, Dave?" his foreman asked one afternoon as they took a break from installing drywall. "I mean, what do you really know about this girl? Could be running some kind of scam." The comments followed him home like shadows, settling in the corners of his mind even as he tried to push them away. When Emily noticed his growing quietness, his reluctance to meet her eyes over dinner, she felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders like a stone. "They're talking about us, aren't they?" she said one evening after Sophie had gone to bed. "Your neighbors, your friends." David tried to deny it, but Emily had survived too much to be fooled by kind lies. "It doesn't matter what they think," he said finally. "But it does," Emily replied. "It matters because you have to live with these people. Sophie has to grow up around them. And I'm making your lives harder just by being here." That night, she made it halfway to the bus station before David found her. She was struggling with her wheelchair in the rain again, the same storm that seemed to follow the important moments of her life, when his truck pulled up beside her. "Sophie's crying," he said simply, rolling down his window. "She woke up and you were gone, and she's been asking me why everyone she loves has to leave." Emily stopped pushing her wheelchair, and let the rain wash over her face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "I'm not good for you," she said. "I'm broken, David. I'm a burden." David got out of the truck, and knelt beside her wheelchair, not caring about the rain soaking through his clothes. "You want to know what I see when I look at you," he said. "I see a woman who survived something that would have destroyed most people. I see someone who reads to my daughter like she's precious, who makes her laugh, who gives her hope that the world is bigger and kinder than she knew. I see someone who makes me remember what it feels like to want to be better than I am." He stood up, water dripping from his hair, his eyes steady on hers. "If that's broken, then maybe we all need to be a little more broken." Emily let him help her back to the truck, and that night Sophie crawled into her makeshift bed on the couch and fell asleep holding Emily's hand, as if afraid she might disappear again if she let go. The weeks that followed were different, charged with something Emily didn't dare name. David began coming home with small gifts. A book he thought she might enjoy, a cup of coffee from the shop she'd mentioned liking, flowers from the grocery store that were wilted but still held color. Sophie drew pictures of the three of them as stick figures holding hands, their family complete in her child's understanding of the world. David taught Emily to use the adapted controls he'd installed in his truck so she could drive, an independence she'd thought was lost forever. Emily helped Sophie with homework, and taught her to braid hair and listen to her dreams about becoming a veterinarian who specialized in helping animals that nobody else wanted. They were healing each other in ways none of them fully understood, creating something new from the broken pieces of their separate lives. But the world has a way of intruding on even the most carefully constructed happiness. The photographer found them on a Tuesday. Emily was in the park with Sophie, watching her practice cartwheels, when a man with a camera began taking pictures from behind a cluster of trees. At first, she thought nothing of it. Parks were public spaces, after all, and photographers captured moments of everyday life all the time. It wasn't until she saw the article 3 days later that she understood. "Missing heiress found living with single father," the headline screamed across the front page of the Hartford Courant. The photos showed Emily pushing Sophie on a swing, the two of them laughing at some shared joke, Emily's face clearly visible despite the distance from which the pictures had been taken. David found the newspaper first, folded on their doorstep like a bomb waiting to explode. When Emily saw his face as he walked through the apartment door, she knew their quiet life was over. "We need to talk," he said, his voice careful and controlled in the way people spoke when they were trying not to break. Sophie was at school, which meant they had a few hours before her world would change too. David spread the newspaper on the kitchen table, and Emily stared at photos of herself that felt like images of a stranger. The woman in the pictures looked happy, carefree, nothing like the broken person who'd sat at that bus stop months ago. Emily Catherine Harrison, David read from the article. Daughter of tech billionaire Robert Harrison, presumed dead after a car accident 3 years ago. The Harrison family could not be reached for comment, but sources close to the family suggest they had no knowledge that Emily had survived the crash that was believed to have claimed her life. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the walls of their small apartment closing in around her. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I just wanted to disappear." "Well," David said, his voice dry with a humor that didn't reach his eyes, "I don't think that's an option anymore." The phone calls started that afternoon. Reporters wanting interviews, distant relatives emerging from years of silence, lawyers discussing inheritance and legal complications Emily didn't understand. David unplugged their landline and turned off his cell phone, but they could see the news vans gathering on the street below their third-floor window. Sophie came home from school to find them huddled in the living room with the curtains drawn, Emily's face pale with the kind of fear that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with losing the only family she'd ever really known. "What's happening?" Sophie asked, her voice small and uncertain. David pulled his daughter onto his lap, searching for words that could explain how quickly everything could change. "Remember how we talked about Emily's life before she came to stay with us? Well, it turns out some people have been looking for her for a very long time." Sophie nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense. "Are they nice people?" Emily felt her heart break a little at the question. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I knew them once, but that feels like a different lifetime." That night, they sat together on the couch eating takeout pizza and watching an old movie, all of them aware that it might be their last evening as the family they'd become. Sophie fell asleep between them, her head on Emily's shoulder and her feet in David's lap, and neither adult had the heart to move her. "Whatever happens," David said quietly, "you'll always have a place here." Emily nodded, not trusting her voice to hold steady. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, that these months had been the happiest of her adult life, that the thought of leaving felt like dying all over again. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it tight, hoping he could understand everything she couldn't say. The knock came at 7 the next morning. Robert Harrison stood in their doorway looking like a man who'd aged decades in the 3 years since his daughter's supposed death. His hair had gone completely gray, and his face bore the lines of someone who'd learned to live with unthinkable loss. Behind him stood two men in expensive suits, and a woman Emily vaguely recognized as her father's personal assistant. "Emily," he said, and his voice broke on her name. She sat in her wheelchair in the center of the living room, David's hand on her shoulder and Sophie pressed close to her side. For a moment, father and daughter simply stared at each other across the years of grief and missed time. "Daddy," Emily whispered. And suddenly she was 5 years old again, running to him with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting that he could fix anything. Robert Harrison was a man accustomed to controlling every situation, to having answers and solutions at his fingertips. But faced with his daughter alive and well in this modest apartment, surrounded by people he didn't know, he seemed lost. "We thought you were dead," he said finally. "The hospital, the morgue, we identified a body. We buried someone, Emily. We grieved for you." Emily felt David's hand tighten on her shoulder, an anchor in the storm of emotions threatening to pull her under. "I know," she said. "I read about the funeral. I'm sorry you went through that." "Sorry?" Robert's voice rose with something between anger and disbelief. "Emily, you're my daughter. My only child. Do you have any idea what these years have been like? What it's done to your mother?" Sophie looked between the adults, her 8-year-old mind working to understand the tension crackling in the air. "Emily's been taking care of us," she announced with the fierce loyalty of childhood. "She makes the best pancakes, and she helped me learn to ride my bike, and she reads me stories every night." Robert's gaze shifted to Sophie, then to David, taking in the small apartment with its second-hand furniture and children's drawings on the walls. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "Mr. Matthews, isn't it? I'm grateful for the kindness you've shown my daughter. Of course, you'll be compensated for your trouble." The word compensated hung in the air like a slap. Emily felt David stiffen behind her, saw the muscle in his jaw tighten the way it did when he was working very hard not to say something he'd regret. "It wasn't trouble," David said quietly. "Emily's been a blessing to our family." Robert pulled out a checkbook, the gesture casual, but unmistakable. "Nevertheless, I'm prepared to make a substantial donation to show my appreciation. I'm sure you could use the money." Emily watched her father's face, seeing the assumptions there, the way his eyes catalogued their modest surroundings and found them wanting. She saw the exact moment when he decided that David must be after her money, that this whole situation was somehow calculated and false. "Put that away," she said, her voice sharp with an anger that surprised everyone in the room. "David didn't take me in for money. He didn't even know who I was." "Emily, you're not thinking clearly," Robert said, his tone the same one he'd used when she was 16 and wanted to skip college to travel the world. "You've been through trauma, you're vulnerable. It's natural that you'd feel attached to the people who helped you, but you need proper medical care, proper support." "I have proper support," Emily said, reaching for Sophie's hand. "I have people who see me as more than a problem to be solved." The conversation that followed was painful and circular, a dance of hurt feelings and misunderstood intentions. Robert couldn't comprehend why his daughter would choose a 3-room apartment over the mansion where she'd grown up. David struggled to find words for what Emily meant to him that didn't sound like the calculations of a gold digger. And Emily sat in the middle of it all, feeling pulled between two worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. The DNA test Robert insisted upon was a formality that took 3 days to confirm what everyone already knew. Emily Catherine Harrison was alive, legally entitled to a trust fund worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and free to make her own choices about her future. The choice, when it came down to it, was simpler than anyone expected. "I'm staying," she announced at a family meeting Robert had called in the conference room of his lawyer's offices. The room was all polished wood and leather chairs, designed to intimidate and impress. Emily sat at one end of the long table in her wheelchair, David and Sophie on either side of her, facing her father and his team of advisors. "Emily, be reasonable," Robert said. "You're talking about giving up your inheritance, your birthright, for what? A life of poverty?" "I'm talking about choosing love over money," Emily replied. "I'm talking about choosing a family that wants me for who I am, not what I represent." Sophie tugged on Emily's sleeve. "What's an inheritance?" She whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Emily smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since her father had walked back into her life. "It means your grandfather thinks money is more important than being happy." Robert's face flushed red. "That's not fair, Emily. Everything I've done, everything I've built, it's been for you. To give you opportunities, security, a future." "But I already have a future," Emily said gently. "It might not be the one you planned, but it's mine to choose." The standoff lasted for hours. Lawyers spoke in careful legal language about trust funds and medical care and the responsibilities of family. Robert alternated between pleading and threats, unable to understand how his daughter could choose a construction worker and his child over everything he'd worked to provide. Finally, David spoke up. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice steady despite the intimidating surroundings, "I love your daughter. Not for who she was, or what she might inherit, but for who she is right now. She makes me want to be a better man, a better father. She's given Sophie and me something we didn't even know we were missing." He turned to look at Emily, his eyes soft with everything he'd been too afraid to say. "But I also love her enough to let her go if that's what's best for her. If you can give her medical care I can't afford, opportunities I can't provide, then maybe." "Stop," Emily interrupted, reaching for his hand. "David, look at me." When their eyes met, the room around them seemed to fade away. "The night you found me at that bus stop, I was planning to die," she said quietly. Not dramatically, not as a cry for help, but because I couldn't see any reason to keep going. I'd lost everything I thought I was, everything I thought mattered. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "You and Sophie didn't save me because you felt sorry for me. You saved me because you saw something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. You gave me back my life, my purpose, my ability to love and be loved. How could I ever choose anything else over that?" Robert Harrison was a man who'd built an empire by understanding what people wanted and finding ways to give it to them. But sitting in that conference room, watching his daughter choose love over luxury, he realized he'd never understood his own child at all. The conversation continued for another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Emily would accept a small allowance from her trust fund, enough to ensure she could contribute to the household expenses and maintain her medical care without being a burden to David. The rest would remain untouched, earning interest for future generations or charitable causes yet to be determined. More importantly, she would go home to the small apartment where Sophie was waiting with homework that needed checking and dinner that needed cooking and bedtime stories that needed reading. But Robert Harrison was not a man who gave up easily. Over the following weeks, he made several attempts to change Emily's mind. He offered David a job with his company, a salary that would have tripled the construction worker's income. When David politely declined, Robert tried offering to buy them a house, to set up a college fund for Sophie, to provide anything that might make their life together more comfortable. Each offer was gently refused, which only seemed to frustrate Robert more. "I don't understand," he said to Emily during one of their weekly dinners, a compromise they'd reached that allowed father and daughter to rebuild their relationship slowly. "Don't you want security? Don't you want to know that Sophie will have every opportunity?" Emily watched Sophie color at the kids' table the restaurant had provided, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on staying within the lines. "Sophie already has every opportunity," she said. "She has parents who love her, who believe in her, who will support her dreams whatever they turn out to be. What more could she need? College tuition, for one thing," Robert said practically. "Medical bills if something happens. A safety net." "Daddy," Emily said, and the childhood nickname slipped out naturally for the first time since his return to her life. "Do you remember when I was little and I used to build blanket forts in the living room?" Robert nodded, confused by the apparent change of subject. "I would drag every pillow and blanket I could find into the middle of the room and build these elaborate structures that were probably architectural disasters. But inside those forts, I felt like I had everything I needed. It didn't matter that they weren't permanent or that they'd fall down if someone breathed on them wrong. They were mine, they were safe, and they were full of love." She gestured toward David, who was helping Sophie select the perfect shade of purple for her drawing. "This life we've built, it might not be fancy or secure by your standards. But it's our blanket fort, and it's perfect exactly as it is." Robert was quiet for a long time, watching his daughter watch the man she loved and the child she'd chosen to help raise. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than it had been in weeks. "I just want you to be happy," he said finally. "I am happy," Emily replied. "Happier than I ever was in that big house in Greenwich, happier than I thought I could be after the accident. This is what happiness looks like for me." It wasn't the happiness Robert had envisioned for his daughter, but as the weeks turned into months, he began to see what Emily meant. He watched David push her wheelchair through the park, while Sophie ran ahead, all of them laughing at some shared joke. He saw the way Emily's face lit up when she talked about Sophie's progress in school or David's promotion to crew chief at the construction company. Most importantly, he saw his daughter not as the victim of a terrible accident or as the heir to a business empire, but simply as a woman who'd found her place in the world and was brave enough to claim it. The proposal happened on a Thursday evening in April, exactly 1 year after David had first found Emily at the bus stop. There was nothing elaborate about it, no grand gestures or expensive rings. David simply knelt beside Emily's wheelchair in their small living room while Sophie pretended to do homework but actually watched from behind her math book. "Emily Catherine Harrison," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "Will you marry me?" The ring was small and simple, probably worth less than Emily's father spent on lunch most days. But when she looked at it, Emily saw everything that mattered. David working extra hours to save up for it, Sophie helping him pick it out at the modest jewelry store downtown. The love and hope and commitment it represented. "Yes," she said, and Sophie cheered and dropped her homework and launched herself into both their arms for a three-way hug that knocked Emily's wheelchair back a few inches. They were married 6 months later in the small church where David's grandmother had been a member for 50 years. Emily wore a simple white dress that Sophie had helped her pick out, altered to look elegant even from a wheelchair. David wore the same suit he'd worn to job interviews, cleaned and pressed until it looked almost new. Robert Harrison walked his daughter down the aisle, his eyes wet with tears he'd been holding back for years. Sophie served as both flower girl and ring bearer, taking her duties seriously enough to practice her walk for weeks beforehand. The ceremony was small, attended by David's construction crew buddies and their families, Emily's physical therapist, and a few nurses from the rehabilitation hospital who'd become friends. Sophie's teacher who'd watched this family form from the beginning, and Robert Harrison, who sat in the front row and smiled through his tears. When David and Emily kissed as husband and wife, Sophie applauded with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for this moment since the day she'd first seen Emily at that bus stop and known, with the certainty of childhood, that some people were meant to be family. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, with potluck dishes and a cake that Sophie had helped decorate. There were no photographers, except David's co-worker's teenage son, no elaborate decorations, except flowers from the church garden, no expensive band except someone's cousin who played guitar and knew all the old songs. But as Emily sat in her wedding dress with David's hand in hers and Sophie on her lap, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love them not because of what they had but because of who they were, she knew she'd never been to a more beautiful party. Robert Harrison gave a toast that surprised everyone, including himself. "When I lost my daughter 3 years ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small hall, "I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. When I found her again, I thought I could simply pick up where we'd left off, as if the years in between had been just a terrible dream." He looked at Emily, who was wiping away tears with the handkerchief David had offered her. "But the woman my daughter became during those years, the strength she found, the love she discovered, the family she built, that's not something that happened despite the tragedy. That's something that happened because of her courage to choose hope over despair, love over fear, faith over cynicism." He raised his glass of punch, looking around at the faces of construction workers and nurses and neighbors who'd become family. "To Emily and David and Sophie, who've taught an old man that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold or inherited. They can only be chosen, every day, by people brave enough to love each other exactly as they are." The applause was thunderous in the small space, and when Robert sat back down, Emily reached over and squeezed his hand, finally understanding that he'd found his way to accepting her choice not despite his love for her, but because of it. As the evening wound down and guests began to head home, Emily found herself alone for a moment in her wheelchair near the church doors, watching David help Sophie collect the scattered flower petals she'd dropped during her march down the aisle. The October air was crisp, reminding her of that afternoon a year ago when her life had changed forever. Robert appeared beside her, elegant in his expensive suit among the folding chairs and paper decorations. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Emily considered the question seriously, thinking of the mansion she'd grown up in, the trust fund she'd barely touched, the life of privilege and comfort she'd walked away from. Then she looked at David, who was now helping Sophie organize her collection of petals by color, both of them completely absorbed in the task, with the intense seriousness they brought to all their shared projects. "Only one," she said finally. Robert tensed, perhaps hoping this was the moment she'd admit she'd made a mistake. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what love actually looks like," Emily continued. "I regret all those years I spent thinking happiness was something that happened to you instead of something you chose to create." She turned to look at her father, this man who'd given her everything except the one thing that mattered most, the knowledge that she was enough exactly as she was. "But I don't regret any of this," she said, gesturing toward her new husband and daughter. "This messy, imperfect, beautiful life we've built together? This is what I was meant for." Robert nodded slowly, understanding finally settling over his face like dawn after a long night. "Then I'm happy for you," he said, and meant it. As they drove home that night, Sophie fell asleep in the back seat clutching her flower basket, still wearing her pink dress and the small tiara Emily had bought her for the occasion. David reached over and took Emily's hand, their wedding rings catching the light from the street lamps. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. Emily squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from years of honest work, the strength that had lifted her wheelchair countless times, the gentleness that had never once made her feel like a burden. I'm thinking about that afternoon at the bus stop, she said. How I was so angry at the world, so ready to give up. I kept thinking that if one more person walked past me like I was invisible, I'd know for certain that I didn't matter. She turned to look at him, this man who'd stopped when everyone else kept walking, who'd seen her not as a problem to be solved but as a person worth knowing. And then you said those 3 words that changed everything, she continued. David smiled, remembering that rain-soaked afternoon when he'd made a decision that had seemed so simple at the time. Come with me, he said softly. Come with me, Emily repeated. Not let me help you or you poor thing or any of the things people said when they wanted to feel better about themselves. Just come with me, like I had something to offer, like I belonged somewhere. They pulled into the parking space behind their apartment building, the same building where they'd first brought her on that stormy night. But now it looked different to Emily, not like a temporary shelter but like home, like the place where she'd learned that family wasn't something you were born into but something you chose to create. One small act of love at a time. As David helped her from the truck and into her wheelchair, as they carefully carried sleeping Sophie upstairs to the apartment where 3 different last names had become one family, Emily understood that the real miracle hadn't been surviving the accident or finding her father or even getting married. The real miracle had been learning that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with 3 simple words from a stranger who sees you as worth saving, worth knowing, worth loving. Come with me. And in the end, that invitation to belong, to matter, to be part of something bigger than yourself. That was the only inheritance that ever really mattered.